Okay, so today's topic is the rock cycle. And remember from a previous video, there are 3 different types of rock: metamorphic, igneous, and sedimentary. So there's 3 types of rock, and each one of those types, an igneous rock, a metamorphic rock, or a sedimentary rock, can change from one type to another through a process called the rock cycle. Now, you probably learned about the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle in other classes or in other grades. Well, in 6th grade, we're going to talk about the rock cycle. Okay? Now, key thing to remember is any rock can be formed into the other 2 types. So if you have an igneous rock, it can become metamorphic or sedimentary. If you have a sedimentary rock, it can become igneous or metamorphic. And if you have a metamorphic rock, it can become igneous or sedimentary. So any type of rock can change and be formed from one type to another to another. So the steps that it takes to become a new rock depends on what type of rock you're forming. So if we are forming an igneous rock, that type of rock forms from melting. So a rock melts and becomes magma, and then it cools, either outside of the earth, like we learned as an extrusive rock, or inside the earth as an intrusive rock. So igneous rocks always melt first into magma, and then they cool off and become a hard rock. Metamorphic rocks are formed from heat and pressure. So remember, heat and pressure, heat and pressure, heat and pressure. Okay? So metamorphic rocks, you heat them up a little bit, not enough to melt them, but to make them warm, and you put them under great amounts of pressure. So they are being smashed down with a lot of force. So you heat them up, and then you put them under some pressure. And then sedimentary, there are several steps to become a sedimentary rock. It takes quite a bit to become one of these. The first step is weathering. So weathering is when rocks are broken down into sediments. And remember from a previous video that sediments are little pieces of rock that are broken down, really small and tiny. So weathering occurs with wind, water, ice, sand. There's all different types of weathering. But the rocks are broken down into tiny little pieces. And that part is weathering. Erosion are when those tiny little pieces, they move. And this usually happens in a body of water. So the little tiny pieces of rock are now broken down and they are washed downstream by a river. So erosion is the movement of the sediments. Deposition, D-E-P-O-S-I-T-I-O-N, deposition is when the sediments settle into one place. So the rocks are broken down, they're washed downstream, and now they're going to stop in one spot, and they're going to settle here. And that process of stopping or settling is deposition. After these sediments stop and settle in one spot, they are then cemented, or cementation. Cementation. It's when the sediments fuse together. So they sit there, and over time, they start to kind of like attach to each other. So they become very fused together. And then the last step for sedimentary is compaction. And this is when layers of sediments press down on each other. So remember the layers upon layers upon layers upon layers. Layers upon layers. Well, those layers push down on the older layers. And so there's this compaction where the layers of sediments press down on each other and they form into rocks. So sedimentary rocks have several steps: weathering, erosion, deposition, cementation, and then compaction. So a good way to really understand the rock cycle is to draw this triangle. And as you can see, each type of rock can be formed into the other 2 types. So let's take a look at that. We have igneous rocks up here at the top. If we start with a sedimentary rock and we are trying to become an igneous rock, we have to melt and cool. So melting and cooling becomes an igneous rock. If we have a metamorphic rock over here on the side and we want to become igneous, the metamorphic rock also has to melt and cool. You see this arrow is going towards the igneous rock. So if you are becoming an igneous rock, you need to melt and cool. It doesn't really matter what type of rock you start as. If we want to become a sedimentary rock, say we have an igneous rock and it's going to become sedimentary, this line goes this way. And you have to have weathering, erosion, deposition, cementation, and compaction. So this purple line is moving towards sedimentary. So these are the steps you have to have. If you start with a metamorphic rock and you want to become sedimentary, you also are moving in this direction. So there's weathering, erosion, deposition, cementation, and compaction. So we're moving from metamorphic over to sedimentary. And then lastly is metamorphic. And if we have an igneous rock and we're moving down towards metamorphic, we're going to follow this green arrow and subject this igneous rock, put it under heat and pressure to become metamorphic. If we have a sedimentary rock over here and we want to move over to metamorphic, it also has heat and pressure. Okay, so with this diagram, you just follow the arrow to whatever type of rock it is going to form. So if you're going to form an igneous rock, you're going to follow the arrow that points to igneous. If you're going to make a sedimentary rock, you follow the arrow that moves to sedimentary. And as you can see, each rock type, igneous can be made from a sedimentary rock or a metamorphic rock.